Hello everyone, I'm Pilar Arias with Fox News Now. I am currently joined by ASU, that's Arizona State University's Professor Pérez. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And okay, so we've been in full impeachment mode. Can you talk to me about, you teach several classes at ASU, what sort of courses, and have you had any sort of discussion about the impeachment hearings with your students?
Yes, I have. I teach predominantly U.S. foreign policy and national security, but I also teach courses in the history of political philosophy, and in that domain we often talk about political ethics and the role of governing any kind of political regime in the abstract, and thinking about the conditions under which an executive or really any political officer should be removed from office.
What have students been saying so far? Are they dialed in? Are they kind of like, why is this happening? What has the response been?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think there's a lot of students who are very dialed in and have strong opinions, both from the right and the left. It's a pretty diverse student body in that regard. But then a lot of other students, I think, are typical students who are more concerned about passing, calculus or history than what's going on in Washington.
It's funny that you brought up history. We did kind of a little look back at the Nixon era, look back at the Clinton era, but this isn't a repeat. This is entirely different from those historical impeachment proceedings, right? And what are your thoughts on the fact that some of these depositions, some of these interviews, we use big words all the time, were done behind closed doors prior to this impeachment hearing where we are now?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. In the abstract, I don't think that there's anything wrong with it if the interviews or the depositions contain classified information or aspects that are essential to national security. But I think it's important that it remains not entirely private, that and it has happened where now we're starting to see some of these hearings open in public, so we can get a much more transparency with the process.
All right, so we're already kind of looking ahead to possibly next week, possibly a Senate trial even for 2020, obviously, because we're already wrapping up 2019 quickly. What sort of implications do you think, if this were to make it to the Senate, for President Trump's campaign in 2020, for the election as a whole in 2020? What are your thoughts?
I think a lot of it's going to turn on how transparent or bipartisan the House impeachment proceedings are viewed. If it comes across like it's predominantly a Democrat-driven process, then I think the Senate broadly is going to think that it's just kind of partisan, hackery, and sort of quickly move on to something else. If, on the other hand, a number of Republicans in the House join in voting for impeachment, if the proceedings themselves have a general sense of being transparent and open for a lot of Americans, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Senate to take it much more seriously and have a much more prolonged secondary hearing in the Senate.
We've already heard, for lack of better terms, kind of a House divided. We already see this is very partisan in Congress, on Capitol Hill. Do we see anything changing? Any bombshells? Have you been listening in so far, and what are your thoughts?
I have been listening in, and as much as I'm able, and given what I know, I don't suspect to see any bombshells that will sort of change any opinions, in large part because I think a lot of the opinions are really kind of already baked in. Most Americans who are paying attention already have set attitudes about the president, about impeachment, and so it seems unlikely that anything new, big or small, is actually going to move anyone's opinion on that.
A lot of journalists have been using the word, in particular, historic, because these are historic hearings, but a lot of people say, hey, this isn't history, this is a farce, especially when you're on social media. This isn't what we're making it up to be, so to speak. But regardless, you have to think there's only so many times this has happened in history, so whether it's negative or positive, it does have a historic context, right?
To some degree, although I think the framers of the Constitution were smart enough to have such a mechanism in place. So whether or not the impeachment mechanism is sort of used or abused, or whatever the case might be now or in the future or in the past, it's there for a reason. And so I think it's an opportunity for a lot of Americans to maybe sort of go back and actually dust off their copy of the Constitution and actually think about what was going on in framing this Constitution the way that it is.
What do you think we've learned from the past, and what still we can learn from what may come? And what's the hardest about asking this question is that we don't know what may be to come from these impeachment hearings.
Yeah, I think the important thing in terms of what we can learn is really taking a kind of principled neutrality in thinking about what's really at stake. And so, you know, for those listeners who are Democrats, think about, well, if it were a Democrat being impeached under these circumstances, would they have the same opinion as they do now? Republicans, again, same thing. If Republicans were in control and, you know, they were sort of attacking a Democratic president, would they be making the same lines of arguments that they do now? It's an opportunity for all Americans to really think about whether or not they are supporting or opposing impeachment or the president based on sort of their own partisan preferences, or sort of actually taking serious the sort of facts on the ground, as it were.
As a professor at ASU, what would you say the difference is, the textbook, the historical learning versus the current present day aspect? And I mean, are you listening in on these hearings in your classes, that sort of thing?
Yeah, in my classroom, we normally stick to the old, in large part because it gives us an opportunity to talk about these kinds of high stakes moments in a non-high stakes way. You know, if we start talking about impeachment in the classroom, although sometimes that can be very helpful, other times it's less helpful because there's less that we actually know now. But when we're talking about the Nixon hearings from '74 or even earlier, we're talking about eras in which pretty much all that is known is sort of already out there, and we have that kind of critical distance. And that's important, I think, for students, because that gives them a way to learn how to start thinking through a lot of these complex issues. And so as they take those lessons out of the classroom, they're able to apply the sort of lessons of history. That's kind of an overused trope sometimes, but they can apply what they learned in the classroom to sort of what they're reading in the news today.
Political science, political philosophy, national security, foreign policy, those are all kind of very niche studies. Do you have a lot of students that say, hey, that's going to be me on Capitol Hill someday, I'm going to be a congressman or congresswoman?
I do. I hear it all the time, and I see it all the time. Many of my classmates, when I was a sort of college student, myself included, were thinking, you know, if we're not going to go to Capitol Hill to be a member of Congress, we're going to go and work there. And many of them are. They sort of got their degree, they started on the ground, and they worked their way up. I took a slightly different career path, but I see it all the time. And more often than not, you'd be surprised how much political philosophy or how many people find interest in political philosophy who are actually working in Washington.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add about this whole process?
Not that I can think of offhand, no.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And we hope to stay in touch. Maybe we'll see you again.
Alrighty. Thank you. Happy to be back if I can.
All right.